All right, we're about to crack open a document that was, until very recently, one of the most classified secrets in human history. It's not just a file, it's a strategic blueprint, a guide to fighting a war that, by all accounts, was already lost. So let's dive into this incredibly audacious concept, the Parity Plan.
But before we can get into the sheer brilliance of the plan, we have to get real about the situation it was designed for. I mean, it was grim. The planners knew they couldn't just ignore the odds. They had to stare them right in the face and build their entire strategy around that impossible reality.
And when I say grim, look at these numbers. The odds weren't just bad, they were staggering. 98% of all military, technological, and resource power belonged to the alien overlords. And humanity, the resistance, we were a measly 2%. That's not a fighting chance. That's a rounding error. We were outmatched, outgunned, and right on the brink of being wiped out completely.
Which leads to the central question, doesn't it? The one that paralyzes generals and breaks entire empires. How do you win a fight you've already lost? This is the impossible problem the Parity Plan was created to solve. When brute force is completely off the table, what options have you got left?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. The solution wasn't to get stronger. That was a fool's errand. It was to get smarter. The architects behind this whole thing decided that if you can't win the game, you have to change the rules entirely. And that brings us to this core concept: parity warfare. See, it's not about achieving parity or equality by building a bigger fleet or a more powerful laser. No, it's about looking at your enemy's greatest strengths and figuring out how to turn them into crippling weaknesses. It's about bringing them down to your level so you actually stand a chance. And you can see just how different these two mindsets are. On the left, you've got your conventional thinking, a straightforward war of attrition we could never, ever win. But on the right, you have the parity approach. It's a complete pivot. Forget their ships, target their supply lines. Forget their weapons, get inside their heads. This is asymmetric warfare on a planetary scale.
Now, this wasn't just some vague idea scribbled on a napkin. No way. This was a meticulously structured 3-phase operation, and each phase was designed to perfectly set the stage for the next one, kind of like a staircase, leading from these subtle acts of sabotage all the way up to a single decisive final blow.
So, first up, Phase 1, undermine. This is the quiet war, fought in the shadows with misinformation, propaganda, sabotage, anything to create confusion and doubt. Then you move to Phase 2, unify. While the enemy is distracted putting out all these little fires, you're secretly building your network, turning scattered pockets of resistance into one single deadly weapon. And finally, Phase 3, unleash. That's the moment when all those pieces come together for one single, perfectly timed strike. So you might be thinking, what made this whole thing even possible? Well, the plan's architects found our ace in the hole, something the Overlords, with all their logic and all their power, had completely overlooked. It was a uniquely human trait that could be turned into a weapon. And here it is. This one line is the philosophical core of the entire strategy. The battleground wasn't going to be in space or on some ruined city street. It was going to be inside the enemy's own mind. You see, the Overlords prepared for a war of technology, but humanity was planning a war of psychology. This really captures their core vulnerability. The Overlords' greatest strengths were, ironically, also their greatest flaws. Their flawless logic? It made them totally predictable. Their rigid command structure? It meant they couldn't adapt on the fly. And, this is the big one, they were psychologically incapable of understanding irrational, emotional, or creative human behavior. It was a blind spot the size of a planet. But the plan wasn't just about winning the war. The people who wrote it were smart enough to think about what came next, because executing the plan perfectly meant having to face the consequences of that success, and a world that was changed forever. Think about it. The entire plan, all those years of undermining and unifying, it all culminated in this one single moment, one coordinated global strike. And it wasn't even aimed at their armies. It was aimed at the single linchpin holding their entire empire together, and it was designed for swift, total collapse. And that's how it happened. Ultimately, the Overlords weren't defeated by a bigger bomb or a faster ship. Their empire just fell. It crumbled because the Parity Plan had spent all that time systematically creating thousands of tiny cracks in their foundation until the entire structure just couldn't support its own weight anymore. And that brings us to the final, really haunting question that the plan's authors left hanging in the air. It's one thing to unite against a common enemy, to know how to defeat a monster. But it's another thing entirely to figure out how to build a new world from the ashes. Winning the war might have been the easy part. The real challenge, well, that was only just beginning.